1944. A year when the Pacific roared with uncertainty, when the world seemed to hold its breath between explosions, telegrams, and whispered prayers. Far from the thunder of naval guns and the blaze of burning coastlines, a quiet stillness settled over a remote prisoner of war camp just before sunrise. The night had been cold, so cold that the wooden barracks creaked as if remembering storms from years past. Inside, dozens of Japanese women, former nurses, clerks, and civilians swept up by the tides of war, were already awake, their breath fogging in the dim half-light. They had been told, the evening before, with a tone that carried no explanation, at dawn line up outside. No one knew why. Rumors spread like sparks in dry grass. Some whispered it was punishment. Others thought it was relocation. A few feared something darker, something final. But as the sky slowly shifted from black to blue, something unexpected settled over the camp. The guards moved differently, calmer, quieter. The air did not carry danger, but something strange, something almost foreign after months of tension anticipation. The women stepped out of their barracks, the cold soil biting at their bare soles, their breath shivering into the air. But what awaited them was not fear, not anger, not the harsh discipline they had braced for. What waited for them would rewrite their understanding of captivity. It would challenge everything they believed about the enemy, and it would become one of the most unforgettable mornings of their imprisonment. The dawn they feared became the dawn they would remember forever, because nothing about that morning unfolded the way they expected. The sky was still a dark, uncertain blue when the first murmurs moved through the barracks. No one had slept properly, not when the order had been delivered the previous evening, with no explanation, no emotion, and no hint of what was to come. The message was simple, almost too simple for the weight it carried. At dawn, line up outside, nothing more. No reason, no context, no tone that suggested anything except inevitability. For Japanese women who had been held for months as prisoners, nurses, clerks, civilian staff, and a few who had simply been in the wrong place at the worst possible moment, such orders were never taken lightly. Dawn was a powerful symbol in war. It was the time for transfers. It was the time for roll calls. It was the time for punishments. And sometimes it was the time for things far worse. No one knew which possibility waited for them. They only knew dawn was coming, whether they feared it or not. Inside one of the long wooden barracks, dimly lit by a lantern that trembled in the cold breeze, the women prepared in silence. Some adjusted the frayed ends of their uniforms. Some tied their hair back with strips of cloth torn from blankets. Others simply sat, fingers intertwined tightly, eyes fixed on the cracks in the floorboards as if answers might rise from the earth. The walls creaked, old, dry, and weary from months of storms and the Pacific sun. Even the building seemed to sense the tension. A soft thud echoed from outside. A guard's boots. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of step that didn't need to announce authority. It carried authority simply by existing. A few women stiffened. A few flinched. All listened. But the guard passed by without stopping. Only his silhouette slid across the small, fog-over window, then vanished. The night was cold enough that each breath hung suspended, a fragile white mist that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Some of the women pulled their thin blankets tighter around themselves before stepping into their worn canvas shoes. Others, awake most of the night, already stood near the door waiting, not because they were ready, but because they feared being the last to leave. When the first faint line of light cut across the horizon, Dividing night from morning, someone whispered, "It's time." Another whispered back, "So soon?" But the truth was that dawn always felt too soon when fear was involved. They stepped outside. The cold was immediate, sharp, biting, almost personal. The soil beneath their feet felt hard, as though the ground itself had frozen in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Frost clung to the sparse grass along the edge of the yard, glistening faintly in the fragile dawn. The air held a strange, brittle silence, one that made even the sound of breathing seem too loud. One by one, the women moved into rows, each row forming slowly, shakily, then locking into place. Faces pale from hunger, eyes hollow from nights of uncertainty, shoulders tense from months of captivity. They lined up with the discipline drilled into them long before they had become prisoners. Even now, exhausted, underfed, and emotionally threadbare, they could not abandon the instinct to stand straight, to appear composed, to face the unknown without showing the tremor that lived in their bones. What struck them first, the moment that lingered in their memories for decades, was not the cold, not the silence, not even the fear. It was the stillness of the guards. Usually, guards at dawn were brisk and clipped in their movements, sharp in their commands, leaving no room for hesitation or softness. But that morning, something was off. The guards moved more slowly. Their voices, when they spoke, were quieter, lacking the barking authority that typically dominated the yard. They stood with a subtle restraint in their posture, as if they had been instructed not to intimidate. This alone unsettled the women more than any threat might have. Unpredictability is its own form of terror, and then they saw them. Crates, large wooden crates stacked near the mess hall, too many to be ignored and too unusual to be routine. Supplies typically arrived at midday, escorted by trucks or carried by soldiers who handled them with disinterest. But these crates were already in place, arranged neatly, almost intentionally. Their surfaces were marked but not worn, and the early sunlight revealed faint stenciled letters that the women couldn't fully read from a distance. The sight of the crates sent a ripple of confusion through the lineup. Confusion, layered over anxiety, hardened into a tense silence. "What are those?" Someone whispered. "No idea? Food? Relocation? Punishment?" The last word fell heavily onto the ground, as if it had weight of its own. No one knew what punishment might involve. No one wanted to imagine it. For women who had already endured months of captivity, anything unexpected carried danger. Anything unexplained carried dread. A guard approached the front of the lineup, not the strict one whose boots they recognized, nor the impatient one whose temper often sparked over minor infractions. Instead, it was one of the quieter guards, the younger one, with a calmness they did not associate with authority. He spoke in deliberate English, slowly enough for them to understand. "You will come forward in order. Please remain calm," not a command, a request. The word "please" itself was jarring. Some of the women glanced at one another, searching for answers in each other's eyes, finding only confusion mirrored back. A few felt their stomachs twist harder. An unexpected tone was more alarming than an angry one. Mercy in wartime always seemed suspicious. But something else caught their attention as they looked past the guard, an officer standing near the crates. His posture was firm, but his expression was respectful, observant, neutral, not cold, not hostile. He watched the women the way someone might watch fragile birds taking flight, careful not to startle them. This was not normal. This was not routine. Whatever was happening was something they had never experienced in this camp before. The guard at the front of the line repeated the instruction, gesturing subtly toward the crates. And the women finally saw the most unexpected detail of all. A lantern hanging on the mess hall wall cast a gentle glow over a small table beside the crates. And on that table were several items neatly arranged. Something wrapped in cloth, something metallic, something folded. Not weapons, not restraints, not documents for signing, but objects that, at a distance, looked almost ordinary, everyday, human. The tension thickened, heartbeats quickened, no one moved, no one dared to, until the officer nodded. A small gesture, unexpectedly gentle. A gesture that signaled the first woman in the line to step forward. She didn't move at first, not because she was disobedient, but because her legs refused to obey the conflicting signals between fear and curiosity. The guard stepped slightly aside, not to force her, but to give her space. She stepped forward, slowly. Every eye followed her. Her steps were soft but loud in the heavy silence, her shoes scraping against the frosted ground. Her breath came out in clouds. Her hands trembled visibly, whether from cold or fear, no one could tell. As she approached the crates, she finally saw what was inside the open one-folded garments, not uniforms, not prison clothing, but warm clothing, simple wool, rough but thick, a coat, gloves, scarves, and more crates still sealed, waiting. Another woman gasped. A few whispered in disbelief. One woman pressed a hand to her mouth, unsure whether she wanted to cry or laugh or run. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. Acts of kindness did not belong in captivity. Not in war, not after months of scarcity. But the evidence was right there, plain, undeniable, illuminated by the rising sun. The officer spoke softly, confirming the impossible. These are for you. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. No one moved. No one breathed. The first woman hesitated, then reached for the coat with a shaking hand. The guard didn't stop her. The officer didn't redirect her. Instead, they both stepped back, giving her room, giving her agency, giving her space to process something so foreign it almost hurt. Her fingertips brushed the wool, warm, soft, and real. The weight of it pulled a quiet sound from her, half exhale, half sob. And that was when it happened. A transformation, not dramatic, not loud, but powerful, invisible, and slow. The rigid fear in the women's shoulders eased. Their eyes softened. Their breaths no longer came in shallow bursts but deep, unsteady waves. The morning they had feared became a moment none of them could comprehend. The crates, the calmness, the unexpected offering, it all felt like stepping into a different world entirely. For the first time in months, they were not facing punishment. They were facing humanity, something fragile, something rare, something unforgettable. The women did not move at first. Even after seeing the contents of the open crate, soft, warm clothing, scarves, gloves, and simple necessities. They hesitated as though the air around them were some kind of illusion that would vanish the moment they touched it. Trust was not something that lived easily in a Perdue camp, and disbelief settled heavily across the yard like a second layer of frost. The first woman still stood closest to the crate, clutching the wool coat she had been offered, staring at it with an expression that was neither joy nor relief, but something caught between confusion and fear, an emotional limbo caused by an act of kindness she was not prepared to comprehend. She looked almost afraid to hold it too tightly, as if the coat might dissolve into smoke, as if someone might snatch it away and accuse her of misunderstanding. Behind her, The others watched with the kind of silence that only comes when an entire group is too overwhelmed to speak. Their breath rose and faded into the cold morning air, but none dared to break the moment. The guards, too, seemed to understand this unspoken pause, for they made no abrupt movements, spoke no harsh words, and cast no impatient glances. They simply waited, for the women to adjust, to process, to accept. Gradually, the officer standing beside the crates lifted a hand and gestured gently to the next woman in line. She stepped forward reluctantly, shoulders stiff, eyes lowered, each step cautious and measured. She moved as if approaching a ceremony she did not know the rules for. Her stomach churned, not with hunger this time, but with a different kind of tightness, one born from uncertainty. When she reached the opened crate, she paused, glancing up at the officer as though seeking silent permission. He nodded once. It was not a command. It was not impatience. It was acknowledgement. Her hand hovered over the edge of the crate, fingers trembling. She had worked in a clinic before the war, steady, handed, precise, confident. Now those same hands shook like fragile leaves in a winter storm. She finally let her fingertips touch the folded cloth inside, and the moment she did, a strange sound slipped from her lips, a soft, unguarded inhale that carried a hint of shock. The material was clean, warm, better than anything she had touched in months. For the women who had been surviving on threadbare uniforms and blankets that barely kept away the night cold, this was more than fabric. It was protection, something essential, something life-preserving. And perhaps even more deeply, it was recognition. An acknowledgement of their humanity delivered in the simplest possible form. The officer reached into a smaller crate beside the clothing and lifted a wrapped bundle. He held it out carefully, without stepping too close, allowing her space to approach at her own pace. The bundle was tied with a thin twine, wrapped in plain cloth. She blinked in confusion, uncertain whether she should take it. When she finally did, her fingers closed around something small, firm, and surprisingly heavy. Inside the cloth were simple toiletries, items so basic by peacetime standards that they would have gone unnoticed anywhere else in the world. A small bar of soap, a comb, a folded hand towel. But in captivity, where scarcity gnawed at spirits as much as hunger gnawed at bodies, these objects felt precious beyond measure. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, her breath caught in her throat. To her, the items were not just supplies. They were reminders of a world she once knew. A world where she bathed with scented soap, brushed her hair without worry of lice, washed her hands without rationing water. The memories struck her like a sudden gust of warm wind, unexpected and overwhelming. Behind her, the other women shifted, unable to suppress their growing astonishment. Whispers began to slip through the rows. Soft, hesitant whispers like the rustle of leaves in a cautious breeze. Is this real? What does it mean? Why would they give us these things? What do they want from us? No one had answers. The officer stepped back again, making room, inviting the next woman forward. She approached with a guarded expression, her jaw set in a line of emotional armor. But when she reached the crate and saw its contents up close, that armor cracked just a little, barely noticeable except to those who had shared months of hardship with her. Her shoulders, once rigid, lowered slightly. Her breath softened. She picked up a pair of gloves. Thick, sturdy, the kind of gloves meant to actually protect fingers from frost, not the thin, worn ones she had been relying on since her capture. Her eyes swept over the inside of the crate, almost desperately, as if searching for something she might be missing or misunderstanding. But the truth was simple. This was not a trick, not a punishment, not a test. It was an offer, a gesture, a moment of humanity. And that was perhaps what made it hardest to accept, because kindness, especially unexpected kindness, has the power to wound in ways cruelty cannot. Cruelty hardens the spirit, starves emotion, builds walls. But kindness slips through the cracks, reaching the parts of the heart that have not been touched in months, awakening feelings long buried beneath survival instinct. One by one, the women approached, slowly, reluctantly, awkwardly. Their steps were short, hesitant, as if each feared the moment might vanish if they moved too quickly. Each woman reacted differently upon seeing what the crates held. One woman pressed her hand against her lips, tears welling but refusing to fall. Another stared with wide, unblinking eyes, frozen in disbelief. Another traced the edge of a wool scarf with shaky fingers, as though touching a memory. Some of them murmured small thanks under their breath, not sure whether the guards could understand, not sure whether it mattered. Others stayed silent, not out of ingratitude, but because their throats felt too tight to speak. The guards shifted subtly, their expressions unreadable, but noticeably softer than usual. One of them took a step back, giving the women more space. Another kept his hands clasped behind his back, posture firm but not intimidating. Their restraint, their calmness, their controlled movements, all contributed to an atmosphere that felt surreal. Then something unexpected happened. One of the women in the lineup, a middle-aged civilian who had been captured while working near a medical supply post, received a small parcel wrapped with particular care. When she opened it, she found a roll of bandages, clean and unused, along with a small tin of salve. She stared at it for a long moment, her vision clouding. She recognized the salve. It was similar to one she had used regularly at home, tending to minor injuries and burns. She remembered the familiar scent that once filled her workroom. She remembered the faces of patients who thanked her with gentle smiles. She remembered a life where her hands were used to help others, not merely to survive. Her fingers shook violently as she held the items, not from the cold, not from weakness, but from memory. The guards noticed. The officer noticed. The women around her noticed. And in that moment, she clutched something that reminded her of who she had been before captivity. The emotional weight in the yard thickened into something indescribable. Not hope, not relief, something more fragile, recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that even in a place designed to break spirits, a single unexpected gesture could stir the deepest parts of the heart. By the time the 10th woman stepped forward, the atmosphere had changed so profoundly that the cold no longer seemed as harsh. The sky was brightening, soft rays of gold stretching across the camp like hesitant promises. The sunlight touched the crates, making the wood glow. It reflected off the metal hinges, the edges of folded clothes, the faint sheen of wrapped parcels. The women watched each other's faces as they received their items, each expression a story in itself. Their eyes glistened, not only from the brightness of the rising sun, but from emotions too complex to name. Gratitude, confusion, vulnerability, disbelief. Some felt a small, fragile warmth spreading through their chests, a warmth they barely recognized after months of fear and uncertainty. Others feared allowing themselves to feel anything at all. Emotional safety was something they had learned to live without. But the moment continued. Woman after woman stepped forward. Parcel after parcel was given, and disbelief slowly transformed into something gentler, Still cautious, still tentative, but undeniably human. When the last woman received her items, the yard fell into a silence that felt profoundly different from the silence at dawn. This silence was not filled with dread, it was filled with realization. An unspoken understanding moved through the rows. Today was not punishment, not discipline, not a cruel surprise. Today, for reasons none of them yet understood, was a day when their captors had chosen to acknowledge their basic dignity. And that alone felt monumental. The women looked down at the items in their arms. Soap, towels, coats, gloves, small comforts that seemed ordinary to a world untouched by war. But to them, these items were treasures, lifelines, symbols of a humanity they had feared might no longer exist. And in the fragile morning light, they stood together, still prisoners, still uncertain about tomorrow, but holding something that made them feel, for the first time in months, like individuals again. Their hands trembled, not with terror this time, but with astonishment. As the last of the parcels were handed out, a quiet stillness settled over the camp, different from the tense silence of fear that had hung there at dawn. This was a silence heavy with reflection, charged with emotions that could not be named. The Japanese women POWs held the items close, clutching them to their chests, gripping them as if by sheer will they could make the morning last forever. Wool coats, gloves, folded towels, soap, and other small tokens of kindness were more than mere objects. They were symbols, reminders of life outside the fences, whispers of normalcy, and evidence that humanity could exist even in captivity. Some of the women leaned against each other, seeking a fragile comfort in shared astonishment. Their eyes scanned the camp, observing the soldiers who had stood silently, hands folded, watching the process unfold with respect rather than authority. It was an unprecedented display, a scene that contradicted everything they had come to understand about enemy behavior. All their training, all their experiences had taught them to expect cruelty, to anticipate punishment, to brace for disappointment. And yet here, in the frost-kissed morning light, none of those expectations were met. Instead, they were faced with a simple, undeniable truth. Small acts of care could cut through even the heaviest layers of fear. The whispers began to rise, soft and tentative, as if testing the fragile reality they were now living. "Did you think they could do this?" One woman murmured to her neighbor, voice trembling. Another shook her head slowly, lips pressed tightly together as tears threatened to spill. Even those who had worked to suppress their emotions felt the weight of relief pressing into their chests. It was as though a door had been quietly opened, revealing a space where grief and hope could exist together. For months, the women had learned to survive by numbing themselves, by treating each day as a battle of endurance. Now, the unexpected gentleness offered them something far rarer, the ability to feel again. Some women clutched their coats and parcels close, inhaling deeply as if the scents of wool, soap, and fresh materials could fill the emptiness left by months of hardship. The sunlight fell across the camp in long, golden beams, illuminating the frost and the dust, the long shadows of barracks and fences, and the faces of the women lined in rows. The ordinary morning suddenly seemed cinematic, surreal, almost dreamlike. In that quiet, surreal stillness, every gesture became magnified. The way a woman carefully folded a scarf, the soft click of gloves being adjusted on trembling hands, the fleeting glance exchanged between two prisoners that said more than words ever could. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it absolute, but it was tangible. The camp, still framed by barbed wire and heavy wooden gates, seemed to lose a fraction of its menace. The shadows that had once signaled danger now appeared softer, less threatening. For a moment, the women could almost imagine that they were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere where the rules of fear and punishment did not govern every movement. The fences remained, the soldiers remained, and the world of captivity had not disappeared, but its power to dictate their emotional lives had weakened. If only slightly in that morning light, a few of the women began to move in clusters, small groups forming naturally as they sought to share their experiences. One held up a coat, showing it to a friend with a faint smile, the first real expression of warmth since their capture. Another fingered the twine around a wrapped parcel, hesitant to open it for fear that the moment would shatter. Their voices remained quiet, careful, measured, as though any sudden noise might dissolve the fragile magic of the morning. And yet, despite the caution, laughter began to bubble up, a soft, almost hesitant sound, quickly covered by hands or muffled behind shawls, but laughter nonetheless. A sound that had been absent for months, now appearing like a fragile bird taking flight in a world still darkened by war. The women began to notice each other in a way they had not before. Their shared astonishment created a bond, an unspoken understanding that connected them beyond words. They looked at one another and saw reflected in each face the same complex mixture of disbelief, gratitude, and vulnerability. Some had kept their emotions tightly sealed, believing that showing any sign of humanity was dangerous. Now, these walls were crumbling. Even the women, who had maintained stoic facades, could not entirely hide the flicker of tears in their eyes, the slight trembling of hands, the quiet relief that came from realizing that kindness could exist even here. Time seemed to slow, the usual cadence of a pod camp. Commands shouted, meals rationed, work assigned, was replaced temporarily by stillness and observation. The guards remained in the background, their posture respectful, as though aware that the morning's events were delicate, fragile, and profoundly significant. They did not step forward. They did not speak unnecessarily. Their restraint amplified the effect of the gifts, the simple care, and allowed the women to experience something they had not felt in months: control over how they processed their own emotions, freedom to acknowledge relief without fear, and permission, even silently, to recognize humanity in others. Some of the women knelt on the ground to examine their parcels more closely. Soap was unwrapped, folded towels smoothed over cracked, dry hands, gloves fitted over trembling fingers. Each action was deliberate, as if interacting with these ordinary items might somehow stabilize the shock of receiving them. They inhaled the faint scent of clean cloth and soap, sensations so familiar and yet so foreign after the months of deprivation that each inhalation felt like a small miracle. Their faces softened, lips pressed together in a mixture of concentration and disbelief, as though absorbing the reality around them required careful effort. The sunlight continued to climb, spreading warmth across the frost, transforming the camp's cold, muted palette into one tinged with gold. Long shadows from the barracks stretched across the yard, but the women no longer saw them as ominous markers. Instead, they were part of the tableau, a cinematic frame for an extraordinary morning in captivity, where a simple act of compassion had made the impossible feel tangible. The light reflected off the crates, glinting faintly on metal edges, enhancing the surreal beauty of the moment. Even the smallest movements, the brushing of fabric, the clasping of hands around coats, the quiet inhalation of cold air, were amplified, significant, and nearly sacred. And in that shared, suspended time, the women began to whisper stories to one another, small stories of life before capture, faintly remembered rituals, and tiny joys that seemed trivial but now felt monumental. A woman described a memory of hot tea poured in a quiet kitchen. Another spoke of tending to a patient who had smiled despite pain. These were memories that had been tucked away, pushed beneath layers of survival instinct and the daily hardships of imprisonment. Now, however, they surfaced with startling clarity, emboldened by the small but undeniable gesture of the morning. For a brief, fragile moment, the camp became a repository not only of suffering, but also of memory, of shared humanity and of resilience. Some women closed their eyes, allowing themselves to absorb the morning fully. They could feel the cold still biting at exposed skin, could hear the faint rustle of the frost-laden grass underfoot, and could see the long, gentle lines of sunlight stretching across the camp. Yet these sensations, combined with the unanticipated kindness, created a profound emotional alchemy, a rare moment when the harshness of captivity and the warmth of humanity existed side by side. It was a moment that reshaped their understanding of what was possible within the confines of barbed wire, wooden barracks, and strict schedules. Even if this kindness could not erase the months of suffering, it marked a point of emotional reclamation. By the time the sun had risen fully, casting its gold across the camp, the women were transformed, not entirely, not in a way that erased hardship or fear, but in a way that restored a sense of dignity and self-recognition. They were still prisoners. They were still vulnerable. But the act of receiving, of being acknowledged, of being cared for in a way so unexpected, had infused them with a small but vital sense of agency. The morning had not changed the circumstances of their captivity, but it had changed how they experienced it. And that difference would linger far longer than the sunrise itself. Years later, when many of these women recounted the morning, they spoke not of the specific items they had received, but of the emotions those items evoked: disbelief, wonder, fragile hope, and the profound shock of encountering compassion where none was expected. They remembered the soft glow of the sunrise, the careful restraint of the guards, the silence that had been heavy yet full of meaning, and the subtle but unmistakable way that a small gesture could alter the landscape of a human heart, even amidst imprisonment. They remembered that mourning not for the objects themselves, but for what those objects represented: humanity. It was a mourning that became legend among those who survived, a moment of emotional clarity, captured in memory as though through a cinematic lens, where light, gesture, and silence combined to create a tableau of wonder. For the women, that single morning offered something timeless: the understanding that even in a world designed to strip away identity and hope, small acts of kindness could preserve both. It was a morning they would carry with them forever, etched into the memory of who they were, who they had been, and who they might still become. And in the cold dawn light, framed by frost fences and long shadows, the Japanese women POWs learned that the smallest gestures could resonate louder than the harshest punishments, and that sometimes humanity could arrive when least expected, illuminating everything in its path.